People have all kinds of different favourite Pokemon, for all kinds of different reasons. With over 1,000 to choose from, there's something for every taste. This might be informed by somebody's age, interests, personality, or their various experiences with these Pokemon throughout their journey. Some people, for instance, may love Rockruff or Eevee because it reminds them of a family pet. Others might love Infernape because they grew up watching Dragon Ball and the Pokemon anime. Some people might even find the kindness in their hearts to like Aromatisse, even if they're objectively wrong. So, after 6 months of uploads, I thought it might be fun to share some of my favourite Pokemon and what I personally look for in a Pokemon design, and compare it to some of yours. So please drop a comment below with some of your favourite Pokemon, and feel free to also roast some of mine in the comments if you disagree. You might be wrong, but feel free to disagree anyways. So, with all that out of the way, let's get straight into the video. I don't think many people would say that normal types are the most exciting flavour of Pokemon. We need them in the early game so we can get to our sweet dragon desserts later. Fortunately, we do have the odd killer amongst the filler. Amongst my favourites are some of our regional birds. Staraptor for the Gen 4 nostalgia being a great addition to any playthrough, especially thanks to its access to the Intimidate ability, and of course its hairstyle being very befitting of the time. Surprisingly, it isn't even my favourite normal type bird, because I also owe a shout out to Swellow. It is ultimately just a blue bird, not too dissimilar from the Swallow, its real life counterpart, but it still looks awesome, and it has a soft spot for me ever since the fight against Tate and Liza in the anime. Ash struck his own Pokemon with a lightning bolt, and whilst that should be super effective and probably kill it, instead it gives it thunder armor. It makes no sense, but was it cool? Absolutely. Unfortunately, that wasn't quite enough to make it number one. I'm sure you could have all guessed it, but how could I have overlooked the big capital G god of the Pokemon world, Arceus? It is completely awesome. It encapsulates a regal feeling a god should have. With the Azure Flute never being widely distributed, this Pokemon remained elusive and coveted by most trainers for over a decade, until finally we got our first Pokemon Legends game centered around this Pokemon. It might take quite a lot in order to get there by filling up your Pokedex, but once you actually do summit Spear Pillar and manage to play the flute, you get one of the coolest designed scenes in all of Pokemon, and one of the most impressive boss fights we've ever seen as well. And not only that, but once you defeat it, you are granted with an aspect of Arceus, because this Pokemon is in actual fact too powerful for any trainer. So, once you get one aspect of Arceus, you can then actually go over to BDSP and get the Azure Flute there, and actually in these games the Pokemon wasn't shiny locked. So, of course, me being me, this was quite early on in my shiny hunting days, and it became my second ever soft reset hunt. So, due to this golden god, I have a very strong attachment to this Pokemon. Who doesn't love a llama? Even if he was a bit of a dick in the Jewel of Life. Like many young kids who grew up playing Pokemon, I was immediately drawn to the Fire type, because it's the most innately cool of the starter types, even if that is a bit of an oxymoron. My first starter I really got to play with was Chimchar, and my first starter in every generation since has been a Fire type. I will admit, some of them I began to regret. Delphox! This doesn't necessarily mean that they are all my favourites, but they certainly are hiding many more nuggets of nostalgia than a lot of the other types, for all that reason. I also need to mention that two of my absolute favourite box art legendaries both share the Fire typing, being Ho-Oh and Reshiram respectively, but more on them later. Before I shock you all with my pick, I do want to chuck out a few honourable mentions. I personally love the Tepig line, and it will absolutely be my choice of starter when it comes around to playing Legends EA. I think Emboar might be the most overhated Pokemon, full stop. I don't understand why people seem to think it's so ugly. I think it's personally just a bit of a victim of the firefighting fatigue. Don't worry, I love the Big Pig. As well, I am quite a big fan of the entire Incineroar line, even if I'm not a cat person. I think the design is maybe I just ate too many Frosties as a kid. Both Emboar and Incineroar have insane shinies, so that always helps. I also want to give a shout out to Reboot, because I think it is the perfect middle evolution. I prefer it to Cinderace. It builds on the football player concept and has a very distinct personality to the rest of its evolutionary line, and it looks really cool with its tracksuit design and the snood. It is also quite sentimental to me, as it was my starter in Galar, the region based on the UK where I grew up. Especially being a football fan, it does kind of feel like a Pokemon that was designed for me. And I also just need to share this absolutely beautiful illustration rare I pulled from Stellar Crown. Mwah. Whenever somebody asked me what my favourite Pokemon was growing up, the answer was pretty much always Infernape. Of course, it was my first starter, as well as being one of the most prominent Pokemon in the anime when I was growing up. But unfortunately, it's just been overtaken by a lot of Pokemon as I've grown older. So sadly, it isn't even my favourite fire type anymore. But ultimately, nobody will be shocked to find out that Fuecoco is my favourite fire type Pokemon. I love this goofy, hungry little firecroc. I would be lying if I said that I wasn't slightly underwhelmed by its evolutions, but Fuecoco is just perfect in every way. Especially as Scarlet and Violet released shortly after me moving away to uni, away from home for the first time, the games meant a lot to me, and went a long way to avert my homesickness, and Fuecoco was the perfect analogue for my mental dog Dexter, who was just a year and a half old at the time, so I was missing him a great deal. And for that reason, my little boy's on the list. Moving on to our Green Giant, probably my least utilised out of the whole of the starter type. I've always tended to find a lot of their designs quite boring, even though I do owe a shout out to Sceptile who carried me through Auras. Sceptile claws will always and forever be in my heart, but at the end of the day, there's only going to be one pick for me here. That of course being Torterra. Growing up, I always remember being Infernape through and through. I actually vividly remember being at a family gathering and my older cousin would insist that Torterra was infinitely better. Now I've matured, I can see that he was right after all. This was only solidified once I finally played through BDSP. After being traumatized by Flint and his minimizing strength sapping hot air balloon, I was able to beat Cynthia after a couple of attempts with my starter Atlas. And no, the name is not original, but he's still mine, I still love him, deal with it. I just think the concept of having a whole ecosystem on a turtle's back, kind of paying homage to the world turtle, and seeing it blown up to a massive scale in Detective Pikachu was freaking awesome. I hope we see a lot more of these kind of things played with in the future. I actually think I had one of the hardest times picking what was my favourite fighting type. It has an abundance of awesome designs. I already mentioned my affinity for the firefighting starters, and then once you chuck Machamp in the mix alongside my favourite Ultra Beast Buzzwole and my personal choice of Box Legend from Gen 8, Zamazenta, it starts to get a bit tricky. Like I said earlier, Infernape was one of my favourite Pokemon for ages, and in Gen 4 it was also introduced alongside a couple more fan favourites in Lucario and Gallade. I absolutely love Gallade, so when a few years later they introduced a Paradox Pokemon in Iron Valiant that fused Gallade's design with Gardevoirs and then turned it into a robot, it was pretty cool. Especially when you consider I'm a Star Wars fan, they gave it a lightsaber, but realistically it looks like a Magna Guard. I absolutely love this design and it immediately became one of my favourites, and because of that, it was the first shiny hunt I successfully completed in Scarlet and Violet as well. So it makes the list, and unfortunately I'm going to have to upset 8-year-old me for leaving out Infernape. Now for the Ice type, I think I even surprised myself with my choice. I'm quite a big fan of many of the legendaries, with Articuno being my favourite of the legendary birds, Kyurem being a cool design, especially being our first ever fusion Pokemon with Reshiram and Zekrom. Chien-Pao is also a pretty solid design, but none of them quite take the cake. Unpopular opinion, I think Glaceon is the best evolution, maybe tied with Sylveon. I know I might catch a bit of flack for that one. I just think that the ice crystals capture the fragility and elegance that makes this design great. Despite this though, I actually think my favourite is Alolan Sand/Sandshrew. Try saying that 5 times fast. I always thought that the original designs were some of the most overlooked in the original Pokédex, so giving it a new form with a better colour scheme really makes these designs shine. Making Sandshrew into an igloo is just genius. I think it kind of won me over because of this, and the fact I was fascinated with them ever since I watched Pingu as a kid. Poison has never been amongst my favourite typings, but it does have a few cool Pokemon. Iron Moth is one of the better Future Paradox designs, yet it doesn't really feel like a poison type. I also like Beedrill, even if its stats are massively underwhelming and borders on unusable beyond the early game. Its design is simplistic perfection. It is exactly what the name says on the tin. Beedrill. The sharpness makes it feel large and intimidating, with those piercing red eyes being enough to scare the willies out of any 10-year-old trainers. For my actual pick though, despite putting Gengar down on my most overrated list, I would say that Mega Gengar is actually my favourite poison type. This new design feels far more menacing and ghastly than the original. If you remember my criticisms of Gengar, you will know that I actually slightly preferred Haunter design, so Mega Gengar losing its legs and becoming spikier feels more reminiscent of a Haunter, and the third eye and a fixed shiny allows its Mega Evolution to make the list. This has become an honorary starter typing thanks to Pikachu. And no, the little rat didn't make it anywhere near this list. Instead, my favourite Gen 1 electric type is actually Electabuzz. Whilst that might be unpopularity, but due to, of course, being overshadowed by the Electric Mouse and Zapdos, probably the most popular of the legendary birds. But then, a few generations later, in Generation 4, they actually gave it an evolution, which of course then became my absolute favourite electric type. Paul was a twat, don't get me wrong, but his Electivire was awesome. In fact, I even love the whole line. I find it so funny that Electivire has a little plug socket on its back that Elekid can plug into. It's genius. I will admit that part of it might be my nostalgia for Ben 10 shining through, due to its concept being very similar to Shock Squatch, but it's definitely my favourite. The last Comic Con I went to, I actually did my first ever cosplay as Lieutenant Surge. I found an excuse, due to his Hot Gold Soul Silver rematch team, that I could actually make Electivire into my mascot and bring a little sitting cutie round with me. That's just how much I love this Pokemon. But I do also owe a couple honourable mentions to Joltik, the cutest little critter, everyone's favourite railgun Vikavolt, and of course the saber-toothed tiger Raikou, which has actually been my longest soft reset hunt to date, but let's be honest, so worth it. This was perhaps my most difficult selection of the entire list. I've actually changed my mind whilst writing this script, multiple times in fact. Of course, we have Torterra already making the list, and being the Driftwell dude, I remember fighting Clay in his Ace Excadrill and being a huge fan of it, as well as Irises in the anime. It's just cool. Palisand, the Haunted Sandcastle, is such a brilliant and unique design, especially to put in the Hawaiian region. It has one of my absolute favourite shinies with the black sand. It's so creative. Another recent competitor has emerged due to my recent Nuzlocke, where a shiny Mudsdale with stamina actually rescued the rut. Tesco will always be remembered fondly for being an absolute unit. The next Pokemon was one that was actually originally on the list before being swapped out, and in fact it was the other ground type starter, Swampert. Despite Blaziken being on my team in X and Y and Sceptile being my chosen starter in Oras, I find it strange that Swampert actually is one of my favourites, despite the one I had the least experience with. But ultimately, it wasn't quite my favourite. That, of course, being the man of the moment, Zygarde. When X and Y released around 12 years ago, if somebody told me this slug would be on a list of my favourites, I would have laughed you out of the room. Seriously. But after the XYZ anime and subsequent games implementing its other forms, I fell in love. I thought the dog was so cool and adorable. Again, reminding me of my dog Dexter. The complete form scratched the Megazord itch I didn't know I was missing. Years later, I am now the head of the Zygarde fan club. Now taking to the sky, it's time to discuss another fairly competitive type. Having already mentioned a few avian amigos with the normal type, many regional birds being cool designs, as well as a few dragons like Salamence and Noivern, which is just awesome. After my Nuzlocke of Pokemon Scarlet, Gyarados has a soft spot for me because Birdseye, the dragon dancing fiend, was an absolute menace, running rampant through most of Paldea's gym leaders. He clearly didn't want to end up in a paella. There was only going to be one Pokemon though at the end of the day took this spot. That, of course, being the Phoenix itself, Ho-Oh. As I mentioned in my last of every type video, I explained that it was actually Soul Silver that I played as a kid, but as I've grown older, I've grown to absolutely adore Ho-Oh. I've always loved how the Phoenix is used as a symbol of rebirth. It also holds a strong place within the Pokemon mythos as well. It is said to grant eternal happiness to all who see it, and it is seen by Ash at the end of the first episode of the anime. Not only does it bless Ash as he sets out on his journey, but it also creates a promise to the fans. The Pokédex claims that this Pokemon has not yet been discovered, and it creates a sense of wonder that there is far more to discover in this world than what's immediately outside your door. With all that being said, there's no way that I wouldn't make it be the best bird. It's hardly a secret that I love the dark type. In typical 10-year-old fashion, these edgy designs just speak to me for some reason. Despite not being around in the first generation, we have so many contenders for this spot. From pseudo-legendaries like Tyranitar, the most infamous competitive Pokemon ever in Incineroar, the most popular starter in Greninja, and Absol, my personal favourite Mega. Yet, none of them take the cake. I think it was pretty clear that it was going to come down to two Pokemon here, being Zoroark and Darkrai. They have a lot of things going for them, both being great designs and have their own movies, which help to bury itself within my nostalgia-pilled brain and give them a lot more lore than most Pokemon get. But ultimately, I had to go with Darkrai here. After I grew out of Infernape, it has been pretty much my answer to anyone who has ever asked me who is my favourite Pokemon. And yes, they both have their own movie, but they aren't all made equal. The Rise of Darkrai isn't just my favourite Pokemon movie. Darkrai stood up to the gods of space and time, for fuck's sake. It's the epitome of aura farming. And I think it was probably my first taste of actually getting emotional watching a movie as a kid. That thing left a scar. The Psychic type was extremely prominent in the early days of Pokemon, and it was the strongest type in Gen 1 prior to the introduction of the Dark type in Gold and Silver. We have many different legendaries, starting with Mew and Mewtwo, then Lugia, and a swath of them in recent generations with the Alola legendaries, as well as the Paradox Swords of Justice, of which I want to shout out Iron Crown. I already loved Cobalion for its royal design, and I feel like Iron Crown is another improvement upon it. I also love Metagross for being one of our most unique pseudo designs, being an absolute menace that served as one of my favourite champions aces for Steven Stone. Whilst Gallade might not have been my favourite in Gen 4, when it came to Generation 6, I absolutely fell in love with the Mega design, especially being used in Oras as Wally's ace. It was able to overtake everything else. It took everything I loved about Gallade and then added a lot of the design elements I love in other Pokemon, being, of course, the sharp blade arms, and it just becomes this devout holy knight with a lot more white being added to it. I think it has to be my favourite Psychic type. Despite being quite weak, the Bug type is certainly amongst my favourite typings. I suppose that makes sense, given that bug catching is a huge part of what inspired the creation of Pokemon in the first place. It has such a wide variety of unique designs, with inspirations ranging from prehistoric insects to Kamen Riders and everything in between. For me personally, the type peaked in Generation 5, getting an epic mythical design with Genesect, Volcarona being a spiritual successor to Arcanine, and of course my personal favourites in Dwebble and Crustle. Dwebble is just adorable. Its new TCG art, being incredible, just captures the innocence and curiosity I loved about this design. And then when it evolves into Crustle, the Hermit Crab becomes a fierce tank. I don't know why, but ever since I saw one in Berg's gym, I love this Pokemon, and I still do to this day. Despite being a huge fan of many of the water-type starters, particularly in the earlier generations, I'm not going to waste any of your time. It is just Suicune hands down. Ever since I was 6, I've been fascinated by the majesty of this Pokemon. It radiates pure tranquility, and I got the DVD of Pokemon Forever. In this movie, it is this elusive creature that feels somewhat biblical. What with the walking on water and the ability to purify it, I absolutely love it, and comes as no surprise to anyone who has ever watched one of my videos. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan of a lot of the fossils we have besides one being Tyrantrum. I have no idea how it took them 6 entire generations to give us a proper T-Rex Pokemon. I also need to recognise a recent addition in Garganacl. Making a Golem from Rock Salt and its signature move, Salt Cure, and how it's super effective on water types is so creative to me and I love it. But it's not been around for quite long enough yet to win me over. Instead, my favourite rock type is Gigalith. I wish I could give you more reasoning beside it's cool, but it's cool. I love the simplicity of the design, just a big rock monster and it works for me personally. I've also brought it up a few times before because I absolutely love its shiny colour palette. Growing up watching many different franchises, I was always a huge fan of armor aesthetics, and Steel plays right into that for me. I've always loved the toughness of these designs, starting with Scizor in Gen 2, Metagross yet again deserving a shout out, and Corviknight being a perfect interpretation of a British regional bird, perfectly encapsulating the medieval history being a knight and combining it with crows commonly seen in Britain. I also feel it's important to praise Empoleon. The idea to make an Emperor Penguin based on Napoleon feels very smart to me. I love it, and I often feel like it's overlooked due to the popularity of the other Sinnoh starters. It's almost completely forgotten as one of the least popular of the water starters. Unfortunately, my precious penguin isn't quite my favourite steel type. Instead, my favourite is Aegislash. I feel like a broken record at this point saying that I'm always drawn to these royal designs, but this thing is awesome. Honedge is a spectral blade who drains the life force of those who use it, and Aegislash's dex entries state that it has stood beside many kings, and has the ability to recognise those destined to become kings. So in another timeline, we could have easily seen it on End's team. Look at it. Its name, Aegis, is a shield used by Zeus and Athena. It's caked in mythology in addition to being a great design. It's awesome, and it was even my first ever successful targeted shiny hunt, so it has an extra layer of sentimentality for me personally. So I couldn't look beyond it when deciding what my favourite steel type Pokemon is.
Who's that Pokemon?
I may have chosen Darkrai for the dark type, but you couldn't seriously think I would leave Zoro and Zoroark off the list, would you? Specifically, my favourite is Hisuian Zorua. Strangely, I prefer Hisuian Zorua over regular Zorua, yet I prefer Zoroark over Hisuian Zoroark. Rather interestingly, one of the types that is most predisposed towards cool or edgy designs, yet I went for this cute design instead. I already loved Zorua, and yet they improved upon it by giving it these ghostly wisps that make it feel truly ethereal, and for that reason it beats out even the likes of Giratina, the Lord of the Distortion World, and the newest addition to the Edgelord starter pack in Ceruledge. Lastly, but certainly not least, is our most recent addition to the type chart with the Fairy type. I'm not the biggest fan of the more conventional Fairy types we received a lot of in Generation 6 and 7, like Flabébé, Spritzee, and all of the Pink Posse, but there are a few that stick out to me. Strangely, Azumarill, I remember being the first Pokemon I ever built around on Showdown. 11-year-old me was obsessed with this little Timmy strategy of using huge power belly drum builds with Aqua Jet in order to sweep opponents. Was it very successful? No. But that's not important. I still have fond memories of it. Having already assigned Iron Valiant to the fighting type, I didn't want to consider it again. I do appreciate our Eren Yeager design in Grimmsnarl for being so subversive, whilst the Tapu Quartet are very cool and represent the Hawaiian deities and suit the role very well. My actual favourite, contrary to what I said about not enjoying many of the archetypical fairies, I do love the poster child of the fairy type, being Xerneas, our Bauxite legendary that introduced us to this new typing. This Pokemon represents and preserves life, and is also connected to Norse mythology in many interesting ways. The way they link a deer to its dormant form being a tree through its horns is genius. It's reminiscent of the Yggdrasil, the world tree. Its dex entry state is able to share everlasting life with those around it. And in the Diancie movie, it is sought out because it is able to grant additional power to these fairy Pokemon through its fairy aura ability. It's a very cool design that's caked in lore. I just think you can't really top it. And there you have it. There's my complete complete list of my favourite Pokemon of every single type. I know it might not be any kind of definitive list, but at the end of the day, it's just my opinions, and I thought it might be fun to share it considering I've been doing this for 6 months now. I thought it might help you all to get to know me a bit better. And with all that being said, please drop in the comments all of your favourite Pokemon, whether it's just 1 or 2, or whether it's your entire list. I love reading through those kind of comments, and I'd love to see what some of your favourite Pokemon are. So, with all that being said, until next time guys, peace out.